John, I know you're probably tired of talking about Greece, but if Greece left the euro, what would that mean?
The consequences for the global economy are potentially quite severe. Now, Greece on its own, if it defaults on its debt, European authorities should be able to deal with that through their existing mechanisms and save the European banking system. But the real fear is that this will cause concern about other, what they call peripheral eurozone countries like Italy and Spain, who are also highly indebted. And if there is concern that they might not be able to pay their bills, investors will start pulling out of the bond markets of those countries. Now, if they do that, the value of those bonds will go down, and the European banks that hold those bonds will suffer. So they'll contract their lending, both to businesses and households, but that will flow just through the extensive financial linkages in the global economy. That will also flow to other countries, particularly emerging markets like China, Russia, Brazil, and so forth. And if that happens, then you get a contraction of lending to businesses in those economies, and they can't invest and spend, and that contracts the global economy. So that's the potentially very serious consequences of a Greece default. But because we are going into uncharted territory, this has never happened before. A country has never exited from a shared currency. So no one is quite sure how it's going to play out.
With the government going into the budget this week, how does this affect their thinking?
We are very dependent on the global economy. We export a lot to places like the United States, China and Europe. So any event that causes that global economy to contract will also affect us. So in that sense, the government needs to be very wary of what's happening in Europe and the potential consequences for New Zealand. And if it contracts, for example, the exports that we sell overseas, that contracts our economy, that affects the tax revenues that the government collects, and therefore the fiscal position that it has and the debt that it has. So it does need to be very conservative. The government will be very aware of the connection of our banks to the global financial system. Uncertainty in Europe and the lack of trust in the European banking system is affecting the funding cost for New Zealand banks, because New Zealand banks need to get some of their funding from offshore and European and global markets. And if those costs go up, that affects the interest rates that they charge to New Zealand businesses, and also the amount of lending that they do to New Zealand businesses, which could also affect the domestic economy.